the little team at Hoopy, we work with people doing consulting around developer relations. And this isn't a sales pitch, it's a segue into explain that we do consulting, but also, if you've looked in your delegate bag, you'll see that we've done this thing called the State of Developer Relations report. And that's where we spoke to lots of people doing Deverell through a survey, but also through interviews and things like that, to try and understand what's going on in Deverell, how people are performing it, how it affects people's lives, and how companies view it, and how it can work both for developers, for the developer advocates, and also for the companies paying the bills. And if you saw Naomi's talk yesterday, you'll have had a sneak preview of what I'm about to talk about. But we asked this question, as well as, how big's your team, how do you measure things? We also said, is there any other insight regarding the Deverell industry that you'd like to share? And people wanted to share. And so they started telling us things like, well, it's important for us to build alliances between each other so that we can effectively be stronger together. Sometimes it can be hard to get our bosses to understand what Deverell is all about and why it's valuable. And then, as I started reading through the responses, I started noticing some themes, and some of them were quite negative, such as, well, Deverell's really misunderstood, and it's a hard slog to do Deverell in a world that doesn't understand it. Sometimes we have to focus on really short-term goals because we've got an end-of-quarter marketing or sales target, and that's impinging on what we want to do instead of long-term stuff. Doubling growth year on year. I mean, that's hard for anyone, but in Deverell, what does growth even mean? Juggling a million things while staying effective, and then the one that Naomi focused on yesterday, figuring out what the hell we are doing. And the truth is, as Jen said last night in her keynote, Deverell can be stressful for some people at some times. And there are lots of really amazingly positive and wonderful experiences when doing developer relations, but we have to understand that actually the reality of it for some people is a stressful role because there are mismatched expectations. Not everyone understands developer relations in the same way, and so when you as a Deverell team have a different understanding of that as the executive who's responsible for your budget and reporting into higher executives, then, well, that becomes a problem. And ultimately, the way that I think some companies are doing Deverell, and the way that some of us as individuals approach Deverell, not because we're bad people, not because we have bad intentions, but just because maybe some bad habits have built up, or because there are unrealistic expectations of what we're doing, we end up with an unsustainable situation. And I see that, first let me ask this question. And I really want all answers from the audience here. Why do you do developer relations? Anyone? Because it's interesting. Okay, cool. Anyone else? To help others. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Two really good reasons. And there is another reason, though, that perhaps is in the back of your mind, but actually the reason we're doing Deverell is to make this guy rich. Ultimately, we come back to there's someone who is expecting a return on their investment. There's someone out there who is either a member of the 3 Comma Club, like Mr. Hanneman here, or there's some manager or some investor somewhere who wants a return on their investment, quite rightly. But okay, most of us are doing developer relations at the forefront of our mind because we want to achieve something for ourselves. We want to help the developer that we work with, or the developers that we work with, or we have an interest in somehow achieving some business goals. And I think if we get these 3 things in balance, then that will lead to a much easier way to create a sustainable developer relations for everyone involved. Let's look at you first, you as an individual, as a developer relations contributor. So, towards the end of last year, I saw this tweet, and if you don't follow Emily Freeman on Twitter, then you absolutely should. And she made this joke: Deverell folks get sick in December because it's the only time they can. And it's funny because it's true. But that set me thinking about my own story in developer relations and about what I see happening and how that relates to sustainability. And it made me think of this number. Back in 2013, I was working for a company that was described as the frat house NoSQL company. Thankfully, in the London office, we were slightly less frat boyish. But I made I visited 40 foreign cities in 1 year. And that's like one every 8 days, if you average it out across the year. But actually, the way that we did it was, we'd fly into a city, see a customer, because of course Deverell was doing pre-sales in this company, and then we'd do a meetup in that city. Then we'd get on another flight maybe, or an overnight train or something, to another city. We'd do something there, get on another flight, and then we'd kind of daisy chain these trips across Europe mostly. And it wasn't sustainable. It wasn't a good time. We helped developers achieve things. We made friendships, we learnt, but ultimately the company went bankrupt. So why did I put my life on hold effectively for a year in order to do that? And we see this a lot, right? There's this hashtag DevRelLife. And you see people who are, humble brag is an interesting word, but you see people who are making a statement about what it means to do developer relations that I think is unhelpful. And that people aren't doing that because they're bad people or it's coming from a bad place. It's just an expression of frustration at some of the ways in which developer relations can be played out in an unhelpful and unsustainable way. And so you see tweets like this, people dressing up developer relations as a lifestyle that means effectively burning Antarctic ice, by flying across the world, by talking about how they've achieved status. Status on an airline is not a benefit, it's a trap. I found myself idly wondering about what trips I could make between May and the end of this month in order just to nudge myself over onto gold status. And then I thought, oh, what am I doing? What am I doing with my life? And I realized that that was not a good way to live. So travel is necessarily a part of what many of us do. But I think we've got to be careful about how we present ourselves and how we think about the impact that we're having on the environment, on the budgets that we are custodians of, and on the developers that we see. And I'll talk about that a bit more in a moment. But the main thing to remember is Deverell is a job. It is not a lifestyle. It is not something that we should be seeing as an aspirational kind of Instagram existence where we talk about all the different and photograph all the different places that we've seen. Now, Brandon yesterday spoke about some of the real great upsides of being privileged to travel in our jobs. And don't get me wrong, I'm really excited to go and see a new place and to meet new people and to connect with new developer communities. But I think there are some things that we should understand what it means when you travel too much. Basically, you get exhausted. I was talking to someone yesterday about how the average life time of a developer relations person, not their life, but their existence in a role, used to be about 1 year and 8 months. If you went across different companies, then about 18 to 20 months into the role, people would go, oh, I've had enough. I can't do this anymore. And that's also with mismatched expectations. It's to do with lots of travel and so on. But then, when I was doing those trips in and out of cities and kind of showing up and doing almost a drive-by Deverell, the result actually was often indifference from the developers. You're not forming meaningful relationships with people if you're skipping from one city to the next. You go into a meetup and you're doing your thing, and then you disappear. And then they don't see you again for a year or ever again. What does that really mean? How is that sustainable? How are you building something meaningful for the developers there that you're trying to reach? And for the business, someone's going to ask you eventually, where is the return on this investment that they're making in you? And so I think there are some things that we need to do every time before we book a flight. And, think about how you can serve your overall strategy in a different way. Write a blog post. Fix a bug, write some documentation, reach out to someone on Slack who is in the geography that you want to reach, and see if you can partner with them to deliver the content or the experience you want to deliver without getting on a plane, without getting on a train, without getting on a boat maybe. I don't know. But maybe make someone in your community feel valued and help them to then reach out and become a center of, a contributor to the community. So we talk a lot about social capital in developer relations. If you can help someone build their social capital, then they will in turn help others build their social capital within the developer community, and that's probably more valuable long term than you speaking at a conference where maybe 20 people come to your talk. The main thing though is, before you get on a flight, ask how would this trip serve our strategy? And if you don't really know what your strategy is, take a step back and work it out. But also we need to be conscious of how we present ourselves. Like I mentioned, that kind of Instagram lifestyle it's easy to get into that trap of thinking, how can I maximize my points? What next place am I going to see? But I think it's, in order for us to have that longer role in a company, and there are companies like IBM or Google or Facebook or Amazon where Deverell is really part of the infrastructure, and it's there to stay. But if you're in a smaller company, ultimately, or a company that maybe like a bank that's just getting into Deverell, ultimately you're going to fall into that trap of maybe being seen as the party people. And so I think we've got to be careful about having fun on Twitter, sure, but also being able to back that up with something serious, something that says, this is the contribution that I made to the people that I serve, whether that's the developer community or the people that I report to as my managers, my investors, whoever it is. Okay, so what about the business then? I think often sustainability here is a problem of mismatched expectations. So as we come down this kind of very, very simple org chart, I think the understanding of developer relations increases, but we get more and more distant from the people who have the power. And so a CEO might see developer relations in terms purely of marketing, for example. And so they'll expect you maybe to have a set of metrics and a set of ways of working that don't actually fit Deverell. They fit something else that looks a bit like Deverell. And maybe that's partly our fault. Maybe we haven't always been that great at communicating back into the business what Deverell is. And I've worked in teams where they actively siloed themselves out. Well, okay, let me say, we actively siloed ourselves out from the marketing team. We didn't want to be involved with the CMO because the CMO was doing things that actually were actively harmful to our perception amongst developers. And if we do that and we don't engage with the business, we don't engage with our colleagues and explain the benefits of what we're doing, then it's understandable that maybe when there's a downturn or a new CEO comes in, that Deverell isn't maybe seen as a top priority. And I think we need to explain to our colleagues that Deverell is a process. It's something that goes on and on and on. And I really hate this phrase because it's kind of tied up in militarism and so on. But you can think of it as a war of attrition almost, which I want to find a better phrase than that. But you're taking one step at a time. People kind of come in and I've spoken to startup founders and they say, hey, we want to have a really amazing impact. We want to have this hyper growth moment amongst developers. And Daniel spoke about not looking for the idea, but looking for how you can serve. And often it's a case of luck and being in the right place at the right time that leads to that idea or that way of serving blowing up into something that really turns into a hypergrowth moment. In most of what we do in developer relations, it is a process. It's not magic. It's not, and marketers have the same problem as well of people who don't understand marketing expect great things to happen after a Google Ads campaign goes out, but actually it's a long process. And I think also we need to get comfortable with explaining Deverell to our colleagues in terms that make sense to them. And so if they understand what we're doing in terms of marketing or product, then explain it to them in terms of marketing or products. Like there's this phrase: if it walks like a duck, sounds like a duck, and looks like a duck, then maybe it is a duck. And I'm not saying that you have to go and pretend that what you're doing is marketing or pretend that what you're doing is product, but at least be prepared to explain what you're doing in terms that your colleagues understand and that your management understand, because then that helps us to then have a more sustainable way of doing things. And this is a kind of difficult place to say this, but a lot of how we practice Deverell is almost kind of Silicon Valley imperialism. We're going out there, or cultural imperialism. We're going out there and trying to replicate a model of addressing developers, say in Nairobi or in Munich, that works here, but wouldn't necessarily be culturally appropriate there. So I think we've got to be very careful about approaching Deverell in a way that is appropriate to local communities and norms. Because otherwise, again, it won't be sustainable. Okay, so quickly talking about the developer and sustainability there. There's a problem of overfishing the same developers, because if in our communities we find that there are like 4 or 5 people, or 10 or 20 people who are really responsive and really engaged and so on, it's important that we work with them, sure, but we've also got to make sure that we don't burn them out, we don't tire them out, and that we find ways of making this a repeatable process, a sustainable process where we can work with other developers as well and build other people up in the community. Also, we've got to be careful, like I said, about relying on the same techniques with developers. So when you do meet up, beer is exclusionary. We had beer last night, that's fine, but if you hold your meetup in a pub or a bar on a Wednesday evening, then you're going to be excluding people who don't feel comfortable in bars or have childcare issues in the evening. So we've got to be careful about not just having a photo fit kind of identikit way of dealing with what we do. And also T-shirts. I mean, T-shirts are great, don't get me wrong, and I love a good T-shirt, and I love the fact that we give them out, but it's hard sometimes to stand out if all you're doing is using the same techniques as everyone else. And then that becomes unsustainable because you won't get the results that you need. And so I think it's important to be very aware of what a developer looks like. Not having this kind of idea that they're generally under 30 or under 40 and in a certain phase of their life, in a certain way of being. We need to be open and reach the people where they are rather than just where we've done it always before. And so in that way, I want to talk quickly about something that Scott Hanselman talks about, the idea of the dark matter developers. There's a whole group of developers out there that we can't reach through our normal ways, because at the end of the day, they shut their laptop, leave it on the desk, and go home and do something else. So you have these hard-to-reach people, and it's really important that we don't just keep mining the same group of people, because they'll become less and less receptive to our message if all we do is always speak to the same people. If 20, 30 different developer relations programs are all trying to get in on the same group of people, then it's going to be really hard. So we've got to find creative ways to reach these other developers who aren't coming to meetups, aren't going to conferences, don't read Twitter, don't go on the same blogs that we use to reach people. And I think Hacktoberfest and what they've been doing is an amazing way to show that you can reach, even using the same techniques that we do. You can reach other communities, you can reach other people by incentivizing them and going out and finding them. So can we fix this situation? Of course we can. I'm not saying that things are bad, I'm just saying there's 1 or 2 things that could be better. So I think we've got to look at developer relations as a virtuous cycle of you do something that builds up developers then do something that build up your business, because ultimately they're paying the bills, and then that feeds you, and really it becomes a Venn diagram of goodness and just supporting each other, and that becomes then sustainable. So what can we do on the you side? We need to present ourselves in a way that resonates with the audience that we're talking to, whether that's the business or the developers or other DevRel people. working ourselves to burnout is not going to help anyone. We've got to have a strategy and act strategically, and remember that it's not a lifestyle, it's a job. In terms of the business, basically have a really well worked out strategy that serves the broader strategy of your business, so that when you're doing DevRel things, you're doing them in line with what the rest of the business is doing. Don't swim against the tide. And if you find yourself in a company where you would have to adopt a DevRel strategy that you would think wouldn't work or would make you feel uncomfortable, then it's okay. Go and find another job. Phil in his talk yesterday spoke about how sometimes companies change or people change, and don't see that as a blight on you. Instead, take advantage of the really buoyant job market and find somewhere where you're better, where your goals align better with that business. And in terms of the developer, I think we've got to be really creative about how we try and reach people. Beer, pizza, and t-shirts works only for a certain group of people. So try and understand the needs of the developers that you want to reach and that aren't being reached now, and who could be built up by your program. And be creative in meeting their needs rather than just mining the same group of people over and over again. I'd like to invite you to join the Deverell newsletter, but also I'd really like you to submit your talk for DevRelCon London. Thank you very much for listening. I'll be around, obviously, if you want to talk. And that's it. Thank you.